We do not have a military today that can fight a large-scale ground war in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, if we fight the Russians, we will lose. Joe Biden, you're writing checks the American body can't cash. Now, what is NATO? We call it a military alliance. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, it was truly an alliance of military powers. The military that the United States had deployed into Europe at that time, over 300,000 men and women, was the finest military the world's ever seen. A military capable of engaging in large-scale ground combat in Europe and winning. And I say that because I was one of them. And I'm telling you right now, if anybody thought they could beat us, they were wrong. Maybe. we never got tested, thankfully. But we were good because we trained, because we were organized, because we were prepared. But then something happened. The Cold War went away. And for the decade of the 90s, we were looking more at the peace dividend from the Cold War than we were at sustaining our military supremacy. Even though we talked a big game, and this is a very important thing, we talked a very big game. But we weren't the same. By 1998, we weren't the same military that existed in 1991. We were far diminished military. We barely had enough resources in 2003 to take on a depleted Iraqi military. We almost ran out of logistics. A lot of people who study the invasion and occupation of Iraq will know that we had an operational pause before we moved on to Baghdad because we ran out of everything. And had the Iraqis been half as good as some people thought they were, we might not have won that war in the time frame that we thought. It was a very close run thing because we weren't that good anymore. And then another thing happened after 9/11. We started getting focused on low intensity conflict. We're fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but not the kind of wars where you close with to destroy the enemy through firepower maneuver involving hundreds of thousands of troops, tens of thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. We're talking about small unit conflict where patrols are going out of platoon size, company size, maybe of a battalion sized operation. We forgot how to fight big war. We didn't train for it. And I'm telling you right now, if you don't train for it, you can't do it. You can't do it. We do not have a military today that can fight a large-scale ground war in Europe. We do not have a military today that can fight a large-scale ground war in Europe. I'll say it one more time because this is important. We do not have a military today that can fight a large-scale ground war in Europe. And yet, what is the president positioning us to do? Fight a large-scale ground war in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, if we fight the Russians, we will lose. We will lose hands down. It won't even be close. NATO doesn't exist anymore. Oh, it's there as an organization. When I was in, the British had the British Army on the Rhine. 80,000 guys, highly trained. Today they barely have 80,000 guys in their entire military. Ask the Brits to put together a brigade and send it out their island into Europe. They can't do it. They can't do it. Ask the French. They can't do it. Ask the Germans. They can't do it. No one can do it. This is why Joseph Borrell, who is the head of foreign policy for the European Union, is freaking out right now because he recognizes the trajectory that Europe's on, which implies the potential for combat with Russia. And he says Europe cannot beat Russia in a war. That's an absolute statement of fact. The Russians today are organized to fight large-scale ground combat in Europe. And when I say organized to fight, that means organized to win. How do we know this? Well, we see it right now, ladies and gentlemen. You can talk about the Ukrainians all you want. I'll tell you this. Not only were they one of the largest militaries in Europe, they were one of the best equipped militaries in Europe, one of the best trained militaries in Europe, one of the most competent militaries in Europe. This is the Ukrainian army I'm talking about. The Ukrainian army was capable of defeating, hands down, any army in NATO besides the United States. Maybe the Turks. But everybody else, Ukrainians would wax them. They're that good. And yet Russia is crushing them. Crushing them. That doesn't mean that Russia's not taking losses. Man, when you step into the ring with a heavyweight fighter, he's going to hit you. He's going to hit you hard, and if you're not careful, he's going to knock you out. And the Ukrainians are fully capable of delivering some heavy blows, and they have. The Russians aren't perfect. They have made mistakes, and they have paid a price. But the sign of a professional organization is your ability to adapt and overcome. And the Russians have adapted and they've overcome. Today, we have people saying the Russian army officers aren't that good, their army's not that good. The battalion commanders that the Russians have on the ground in Ukraine today are the finest battalion commanders the world has ever seen. These guys are doing miracles. America's battalion commanders would do well to study what these guys are doing. How you lead from the front, sustain combat operations for 100 days, and you get better, not worse. That's a sign of a professional. The Russians are winning, hands down, and they are going to win, hands down. There's nothing that can happen to stop this. Nothing. But there's a problem. We can make the cost for Russia very high. We make it so high that it actually becomes painful. And if we make it too high, then we have what we call a game-changing moment. And we're on the verge of reaching that. We're providing the Ukrainians with weapons that are not going to change the outcome of the war. They are not. But what it will do is kill Russians. It will kill Russians in large numbers. And this will make it more difficult for Russia to win its victory in a reasonable time frame. It'll drag this conflict out. Now, Russia will win, but the price that will be paid by Russia will be very high, and the price paid by Ukraine will be even higher. If you care about the Ukrainian people, if you give a damn about humanity, then you'd want this war to be over today. Because all that's going to happen between now and the inevitable termination of this conflict is tens of thousands of Ukrainians are going to die. Ukrainian infrastructure will be destroyed. But that's not even the worst that can happen. The worst that can happen is when Russia decides that America has gone too far. You see, this is not a war that's being fought in Ukraine. It's a special military operation. And you should probably look into what that means. It means that Russia's carrying out pretty much a punitive police action to punish Ukraine for 8 years of violence inflicted on the Russian population of the Donbass. This was not a war of conquest. This was not a war of domination. Yes, they did some things in Kiev to shape the battlefield, but the primary objective is to close with and destroy 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian troops that were threatening Donbass. And the Russians are achieving that as we speak. But the price that they're paying is very high. And we're treating it as if it's a war. We have a defense secretary who has said that the purpose of the United States is basically to bleed Russia dry, to achieve a strategic victory by making the Russians pay such a heavy price that they are no longer able to threaten Europe. Well, if you're a Russian listening to that, what are you thinking? Okay. No, we are creating bitterness, anger, resentment in Russia. And at some point they're going to cross the line and they're going to fire missiles outside of Ukraine, into American targets, into NATO targets, and now we're talking a real war, one that we won't win. Joe Biden, you're writing checks the American body can't cash. That's a statement of fact.